You know that feeling when you realize your manager sabotaged your career, and then 3 years later, you bought the company? Yeah, that's exactly where this story's headed, and trust me, the journey was worth every sleepless night. But let me back up to the moment my world imploded. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were when Derek held his precious department meetings, and I'd been looking forward to this one for weeks. The promotion to senior marketing director was practically mine. Hell, I'd been doing the job for 6 months already without the title or the pay. My presentation deck was polished to perfection, complete with metrics showing how my campaigns had boosted quarterly revenue by 37%. I walked into that conference room feeling like I owned the place. The morning sun was streaming through those floor-to-ceiling windows, and I swear even the coffee tasted better. That confidence was radiating from every pore as I set up my laptop, nodding at the usual suspects around the mahogany table. Derek strolled in 5 minutes late, as always, with that smug little smile that should have been my first warning. But I was too pumped up on my own success to notice the predatory gleam in his eyes. The meeting started normally enough. Budget reviews, campaign updates, the standard corporate theater. Then Derek cleared his throat in that self-important way of his and announced he had some exciting news to share. My heart started doing these little victory laps in my chest. This was it. This was my moment. "I'm pleased to announce that we'll be promoting someone to senior marketing director," Derek said, his voice carrying that fake enthusiasm he reserved for company-wide emails. After careful consideration of all our talented team members, the pause felt like it lasted forever. I could feel my smile getting wider, my shoulders straightening. I was already mentally calculating my new salary, planning the celebration dinner I'd take my team out for. "I'm thrilled to welcome Brad Morrison to his new role." The words hit me like a physical blow. My chest tightened, and suddenly that perfect morning coffee turned to acid in my stomach. Brad fucking Morrison, the guy who'd been with the company for 8 months. The guy whose biggest accomplishment was creating a social media campaign that got 12 likes. I must have made some kind of sound, a sharp intake of breath, maybe a strangled laugh, because Derek's eyes found mine across the table. And there it was, that little smirk. That tiny upturn of his lips that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't about qualifications or performance metrics or who deserved what. This was deliberate. The room erupted in polite applause, and I found myself clapping along like some kind of trained seal, my hands moving on autopilot while my brain tried to process what the hell had just happened. Brad was grinning and accepting congratulations, shaking hands and playing the humble winner routine. But I couldn't stop staring at Derek. He was watching me with this satisfied expression, like a cat that had just knocked over a glass of water and was waiting to see how big the mess would be. The meeting dragged on for another 20 minutes, but I didn't hear a word of it. My mind was racing, replaying every interaction I'd had with Derek over the past year. Every time he'd praised my work in public. Every time he'd asked me to take on additional responsibilities. Every time he'd hinted that big things were coming for me. It was all bullshit. Every single word. When the meeting finally ended, I somehow managed to make it back to my desk without falling apart completely. My legs felt like jelly, and there was this ringing in my ears that made everything sound muffled and far away. I sat down in my chair and stared at my computer screen, watching the cursor blink in the search bar where I'd been looking up Senior Marketing Director salary ranges. Just an hour earlier. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of answering emails and attending calls while my world quietly crumbled around me. Every time someone congratulated Brad, I felt another piece of my professional dignity chip away. Every time Derek walked past my desk with that satisfied swagger of his, my jaw clenched a little tighter. By 5 o'clock, the office had mostly cleared out, but I stayed glued to my chair. I kept telling myself I needed to finish up some reports, but really, I just didn't trust myself to walk out of there without doing something I'd regret. The anger was building inside me like pressure in a tea kettle, and I could feel it getting closer and closer to the breaking point. That's when Derek appeared at my cubicle. "Hey there," he said, leaning against my desk like we were old friends. "Rough day?" The casual tone of his voice made my teeth grind. He knew exactly what kind of day I'd had. He'd orchestrated it. "I'm fine," I managed to get out, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. "You know," Derek continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that I was 2 seconds away from launching myself across the desk, "I hope you understand that this decision wasn't personal. Brad just brought something different to the table." "Different? Like what?" A fucking trust fund and a fraternity alumni network? Of course, I said, forcing my lips into something that might have resembled a smile. I'm happy for Brad. Derek nodded approvingly, like I was a good dog who'd learned to sit on command. That's the attitude we like to see. You're a real team player? A team player? Jesus Christ. He patted my shoulder, actually patted my shoulder like I was some kind of consolation prize, and walked away, whistling some tune I didn't recognize. I watched him disappear around the corner, and that's when it finally hit me. This wasn't just about the promotion. This was about Derek establishing his dominance, reminding me and everyone else in the office exactly who held the power. I was the example he was making. The cautionary tale. Work hard, exceed expectations, prove your worth, and still get passed over because Derek Morrison decided you needed to be put in your place. I sat there in that empty office, surrounded by the hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic outside, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and raw and overwhelming, but underneath it, something else was taking root. Determination. No, that's not quite right. What I felt was more specific than that, more focused. I felt the beginning of a plan. The drive home was a blur of red traffic lights and half-formed ideas. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, and I kept replaying Derek's patronizing voice in my head. That casual dismissal, that confident assumption that I'd just roll over and take it. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew 3 things with absolute certainty. First, I was going to quit my job. There was no way I could keep working under Derek after what he'd pulled. My self-respect wouldn't survive it. Second, I was going to make sure Derek regretted this decision for the rest of his miserable career. And third, I was going to enjoy every single second of watching his world crumble. I just had to figure out how. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and a notebook, writing down everything I knew about Derek Morrison. His habits, his weaknesses, his ambitions, the way he kissed ass to upper management while stepping on everyone below him, his tendency to take credit for other people's work, his complete lack of actual marketing knowledge beyond buzzwords and corporate speak. The wine helped steady my nerves, but it was the writing that helped steady my mind. Each fact I wrote down felt like a small piece of ammunition. Each weakness I identified felt like a tiny victory. Derek thought he'd broken me today. He thought he'd put me in my place and taught me a lesson about knowing my role. What he didn't realize was that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. He'd pissed off someone with nothing left to lose. I handed in my resignation the next morning. No dramatics, no storming into Derek's office with a middle finger salute, though God knows I fantasized about it. Just a simple, professional letter delivered to HR with a 2-week notice. The look on Derek's face when he found out was worth every penny I'd be losing by walking away from my steady paycheck. He actually had the balls to call me into his office and ask why I was leaving. I've decided to pursue other opportunities, I told him, keeping my voice as neutral as possible while inside I was screaming, because you're a backstabbing piece of shit who wouldn't recognize talent if it tattooed itself on your forehead. Derek leaned back in his oversized leather chair, the one he'd probably picked specifically because it made him feel important, and studied me with those calculating eyes of his. You know, he said, I hope this isn't about the promotion. These things happen in business. You can't take it personally. Can't take it personally. Right. Because systematically undermining someone's career for 6 months is just business as usual. Of course not, I replied, maintaining that practiced smile I'd perfected during my years of corporate servitude. Like you said, business is business. The irony of those words would become apparent soon enough. Those 2 weeks felt like the longest 14 days of my life. I watched Derek parade Brad around like a prized poodle, introducing him to clients and stakeholders as if he'd personally discovered the next marketing genius. Meanwhile, I quietly documented everything. Every client contact, every campaign strategy, every piece of proprietary information that might come in handy later. I wasn't planning to steal anything, I'm not that kind of person, but I was definitely planning to remember everything. The morning of my last day, Derek stopped by my desk one final time. He was practically glowing with satisfaction, like a man who'd just solved a particularly annoying problem. Well, he said, I want you to know there are no hard feelings. You're a good worker, and I'm sure you'll find something that's a better fit. A better fit? Translation, somewhere that won't threaten my fragile ego. Thanks, Derek. That means a lot coming from you. He nodded, probably missing the subtle sarcasm entirely, and walked away. I watched him go, and for a moment I felt something that might have been pity. The poor bastard had no idea what he'd just unleashed. The first few months after leaving were rough. I'll admit it. I'd burned through most of my savings by month 3, and the job market was brutal. Turns out, leaving a company without another position lined up doesn't look great on paper, especially when you can't exactly explain that you quit because your manager was a manipulative asshole without sounding like a disgruntled employee with an attitude problem. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. It gives you clarity. When you're eating ramen noodles for the 3rd night in a row and wondering if you made the biggest mistake of your professional life, you start to see things differently. You start to understand what really matters. I started freelancing, taking on small marketing projects for local businesses. Nothing glamorous. A restaurant's social media campaign here, a retail store's email newsletter there. But it was work. And more importantly, it was mine. No Derek breathing down my neck, no office politics, no Brad Morrison getting credit for my ideas. And slowly, something interesting started happening. My clients were getting results. Real, measurable results that made their phones ring and their cash registers sing. Word started spreading in those tight-knit small business networks, and suddenly I had more work than I could handle. 6 months after leaving Derek's corporate playground, I was making more money than I'd ever made as his employee. The irony wasn't lost on me. The work he'd deemed not good enough for a promotion was now supporting a lifestyle he probably couldn't afford on his middle management salary. But making money wasn't the point. The point was what I was learning about Derek's company from the outside. See, when you're inside a corporate structure, you only see your little piece of the puzzle. You know your department, your responsibilities, your immediate circle. But when you're on the outside, working with competitors, talking to former employees, you start to see the bigger picture. And the bigger picture was fascinating. Derek's company, Morrison and Associates, because of course the narcissist had named it after himself, was hemorrhaging talent. In the year since I'd left, they'd lost 3 more senior marketing people, 2 account managers, and their entire creative team. The Brad Morrison experiment was going about as well as you'd expect. Clients were jumping ship, and the ones who stayed were complaining about declining quality and missed deadlines. I know this because I was picking up some of those clients. Funny how that works. You screw over your best employee, and suddenly all their relationships follow them out the door. Not because I was poaching them, mind you. I'm too professional for that. But when a client calls you because they're frustrated with their current agency, well, that's just good business. The best part? Derek had no idea. As far as he knew, I'd disappeared into the ether of failed careers and bitter ex-employees. He probably told people I couldn't handle the pressure of working for a dynamic, results-driven organization. I'd bet money he used those exact words. By the end of my first year as a freelancer, I'd incorporated my own agency. Nothing fancy, just me, a part-time assistant, and a coffee addiction that could power a small city. But I was building something that was mine, something that Derek couldn't take away or undermine or sabotage. The second year was when things started getting interesting. I'd expanded to a team of 5, landed a few major clients, and was starting to make a name for myself in the industry. More importantly, I was learning everything I could about business acquisition. Late nights researching leveraged buyouts, studying cash flow statements, understanding the intricate dance of corporate finance. Because here's the thing that Derek never understood about me. I'm not just good at marketing. I'm good at everything I set my mind to. When I was working for him, I channeled all that energy into making his company successful. Now I was channeling it into something else entirely. I started attending the same industry conferences Derek frequented, not to network with him, God forbid, but to network with his competitors, his suppliers, his potential clients. I became a familiar face in circles where Derek was trying to establish himself. The difference was, people actually wanted to work with me. There's this moment that happened about 18 months after I left, at a marketing summit in Chicago. I was having drinks with a potential client when I spotted Derek across the room. He was working the crowd with that desperate energy of someone who knows they're losing ground, but isn't sure how to stop the slide. Our eyes met across the crowded hotel bar, and for a second, I saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, maybe? Or recognition that I wasn't the broken, defeated employee he'd expected me to become. I raised my glass in a mock toast and watched him turn away quickly, uncomfortable with the interaction. In that moment, I realized something profound. Derek was afraid of me. Not because of anything I'd done, but because of what I represented. I was proof that his little power play had consequences. I was the ghost of his professional past, the reminder that actions have reactions. That night, alone in my hotel room, I made a decision that would define the next phase of my life. I was going to buy Derek's company. Not because I particularly wanted to own Morrison and Associates. Honestly, the name alone made me nauseous. But because I wanted to own Derek. I wanted him to sit in a boardroom, just like I had 3 years earlier, and hear someone announce that his world was about to change. I wanted him to feel that same gut punch of betrayal, that same crushing realization that all his confidence and swagger had been built on sand. The technical aspects of acquiring a company are more complicated than most people realize. You need capital, obviously, but you also need leverage. You need to understand the target company's weaknesses, their cash flow problems, their debt structure. You need to know which clients are unhappy, which employees are planning to leave, which vendors are getting paid late. Lucky for me, I'd been unconsciously gathering that intelligence for 2 years. Every former Morrison and Associates employee I'd hired, and there were several, brought institutional knowledge. Every client I'd picked up shared their frustrations with their former agency. Every industry contact I'd made had opinions about Derek's business practices. Building a war chest took another 6 months. I liquidated some investments, took out loans against my growing business, and brought in a silent partner who shared my vision of corporate justice. The partner was a former colleague who'd also been screwed over by Derek, though not as dramatically as I had been. He was more than happy to contribute to the Derek Morrison Takedown Fund. The approach had to be subtle. You can't just walk up to someone and offer to buy their company, especially when that someone would rather die than sell to you. It had to look like a natural business opportunity, something that made perfect sense for all parties involved. That's where my new best friend came in, the market research I'd been conducting for the past 2 years. Morrison and Associates was struggling, not failing dramatically, but slowly bleeding talent, clients, and revenue. Derek was probably lying awake at night wondering how to stop the slide, how to get back to the growth trajectory he'd been promising his investors. The beauty of the situation was that Derek's ego was working against him. He'd been so focused on maintaining the appearance of success that he'd made some questionable financial decisions. Expensive office space, inflated salaries for underperforming employees, marketing campaigns that looked impressive but delivered minimal results. In other words, he'd created exactly the kind of vulnerable situation that makes a company ripe for acquisition. I spent weeks crafting the perfect approach. It couldn't come from me directly. That would raise too many red flags. Instead, it would come through intermediaries, business brokers who specialized in marketing agency acquisitions. The initial contact would be subtle, exploratory. Just a successful agency looking to expand through strategic acquisition. The final piece of the puzzle was timing. I needed Derek to be desperate enough to consider selling, but not so desperate that he'd accept any offer. I needed him to think he was getting a good deal, maybe even outsmarting the buyers. As I sat in my office late one night, reviewing the acquisition proposal for the 100th time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Complete, absolute certainty. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. This was about proving that talent and determination could overcome politics and favoritism. This was about buying Derek Morrison's company and watching him realize that the employee he'd dismissed as not quite ready for leadership was about to become his boss. The phone call to the business broker was scheduled for 9 a.m. the next morning. After that, there would be no turning back. The wheels would be in motion, and Derek's carefully constructed little empire would be about to meet its new owner. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and looked out at the city lights below my office window. 3 years ago, I'd been a broken, humiliated employee walking out of Morrison and Associates for the last time. Tomorrow, I'd begin the process of walking back in as the owner. Derek Morrison had taught me an important lesson about business. It's not personal, it's just business. I was about to return the favor. The acquisition process started exactly like I'd planned, with Derek having absolutely no idea what was coming. The business broker I'd hired, Marcus Chen, was a professional shark in an expensive suit who specialized in what he called strategic corporate restructuring. In normal person terms, that meant he was really good at convincing people to sell their companies without realizing they were getting screwed. Marcus made the initial contact on a Wednesday morning in March. I know this because I was sitting in my office, pretending to review quarterly reports while actually refreshing my email every 30 seconds waiting for his update. When his message finally came through, I nearly knocked over my coffee cup in my rush to open it. Initial contact made, target receptive to exploratory conversation. Meeting scheduled for Friday, 2 p.m. Target. I loved that Derek had been reduced to a military designation. After 3 years of planning, the man who derailed my career was now just another item on a business acquisition checklist. The waiting was torture. I knew Marcus was good at his job. I'd hired him specifically because he had a reputation for closing deals that other brokers couldn't touch. But there's a difference between trusting someone's professional competence and actually watching them execute a plan that you've been obsessing over for years. Friday afternoon, I found myself pacing around my office like a caged animal. My assistant Jennifer had learned to recognize my important business happening, mood, and kept bringing me updates that weren't actually updates, just excuses to check on my mental state. "Any word from the Chen meeting?" she asked around 3:30, poking her head through my office door. "Not yet," I said, trying to sound casual while internally screaming, "These things take time." "Right," she said, giving me that look people give when they're not sure if you're about to have a breakdown. "I'll just be at my desk if you need anything." The call came at 4:17. I answered before the first ring finished. "Well," I said, not bothering with pleasantries. Marcus chuckled, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "He's interested, very interested. And he has no idea who's behind the offer. As far as Derek Morrison is concerned, he's dealing with an out-of-state investment group looking to expand their marketing portfolio." I closed my eyes and felt 3 years of tension start to uncoil in my chest. Phase 1 was complete. Derek had taken the bait. "What's his timeline?" "He wants to move fast," Marcus said. "Apparently he's been considering his exit strategy for a while now. The timing couldn't be more perfect." Exit strategy, right. I'd bet money that Derek's exit strategy was less about strategic planning and more about getting out before his investors realized how badly he'd been managing their money. But that worked in my favor. Desperate sellers make mistakes. How fast is fast? He's talking about having a formal offer by the end of next week. Full due diligence process, financial review, the works. If everything checks out, he wants to close within 60 days. 60 days. 2 months from now, Derek Morrison would be working for me. The thought was so satisfying I actually laughed out loud. "One more thing," Marcus added. He asked about meeting the principals behind the investment group. I told him that would be possible once we got through the preliminary negotiations, but he seemed eager to put faces to names. "Oh, Derek, you have no idea how eager I am to put a face to this name." The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in corporate theater. Marcus and his team descended on Morrison and Associates like a swarm of well-dressed locusts, reviewing financial statements, interviewing key employees, and generally making Derek feel like he was part of something important and professional. Meanwhile, I was getting daily reports that read like intelligence briefings from enemy territory. Derek was selling the acquisition internally as a strategic partnership that would unlock new growth opportunities. He'd apparently given the whole staff some speech about how this was the natural evolution of the company, and how everyone should be excited about the resources and expertise the new ownership would bring. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek was literally selling his employees on the idea of working for me, and he didn't even know it. But the best part was hearing about Derek's behavior during the due diligence process. According to Marcus, he was trying so hard to impress the mysterious investors that he was practically doing backflips to make the company look more successful than it actually was. Creative accounting, inflated client satisfaction scores, the works. "He's overselling," Marcus told me during one of our evening check-ins. "Classic mistake. He's so eager to close the deal that he's making promises about future performance that no sane business owner would make." "What kind of promises?" 20% growth over the next 18 months, guaranteed client retention rates, expansion into 3 new markets within the first year. The kind of stuff that looks great on paper but is basically impossible to deliver. I was taking notes as he talked, documenting every exaggeration and overstatement. They'd come in handy later, during the awkward conversations Derek and I would be having about realistic performance expectations. 3 weeks into the process, Marcus called with an update that made my day. "He wants to expedite the timeline," he said. "Apparently one of his major clients is threatening to leave, and he's worried it'll impact the valuation if word gets out. The client was Pacific Tech Solutions, and I knew exactly why they were threatening to leave. I'd been watching Derek's team botch their account for months through my industry contacts. They'd missed 3 major deadlines, delivered campaigns that looked like they'd been designed by a high school student, and generally treated a $1 million client like an afterthought. How expedited? He wants to close by the end of the month. Full cash deal, minimal contingencies. He's basically willing to accept our first offer if we can move fast enough. Our first offer, which was approximately 15% less than what Morrison & Associates was actually worth, but still enough money to make Derek feel like he was getting a fair deal. The beauty of desperation is that it makes people bad at math. "Let's do it," I said. The formal signing was scheduled for a Friday morning at 10 a.m. Marcus had arranged for it to happen at a neutral location, a conference room at a downtown law firm that specialized in corporate acquisitions. Neutral location, professional atmosphere, no surprises. Except, of course, for the biggest surprise of Derek Morrison's professional life. I spent the night before the signing alternating between excitement and terror. This was it, the moment I'd been building toward for 3 years. Tomorrow morning, Derek would walk into that conference room expecting to meet some faceless investors and walk out knowing that his former employee now owned his company. I'd rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in my head. The look on his face when he realized who was behind the acquisition. The way his confident smile would crumble when he understood that every condescending comment, every dismissive gesture, every casual humiliation had led to this exact moment. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had sustained me through those first few months, the burning need for revenge that had motivated every late night and early morning, it was gone. In its place was something colder and more focused. Professional satisfaction, maybe. Or just the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've outplayed someone who underestimated you. Friday morning, I got to the law firm 30 minutes early. I wanted to be settled and composed when Derek arrived, wanted to watch him walk into the room thinking he was in control of the situation. Marcus was already there, along with the lawyers and accountants who'd helped structure the deal. They were all in on the reveal. It had been impossible to hide my identity from the people actually executing the acquisition, but they'd been sworn to secrecy. Professional discretion was part of what I was paying them for. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked as we reviewed the final paperwork. "I've been ready for 3 years," I said. Derek arrived exactly on time because of course he did. I could hear his voice in the hallway before he entered the conference room, making small talk with his lawyer and trying to project an air of casual confidence. The same voice that had dismissed my concerns, minimized my contributions, and generally made my professional life miserable for the better part of 2 years. When he walked through the door, I was sitting at the far end of the conference table, partially obscured by Marcus and the legal team. Derek's attention was focused on the paperwork spread across the table, the formal documents that would transfer ownership of his company to mine. "Gentlemen," he said, settling into his chair with that self-satisfied smile I remembered so well, "I have to say, this has been one of the most professional acquisition processes I've ever been part of. Your team has been incredibly thorough." Marcus nodded politely. "We believe in doing our due diligence." Of course. Derek was practically glowing with satisfaction. "And I have to say, I'm excited to meet the principals behind this investment group. I've been curious about the vision for Morrison and Associates going forward." "About that?" Marcus said, and I saw him glance in my direction. "I think now would be a good time for introductions." This was my cue. I stood up slowly, watching Derek's face as recognition dawned. It was even better than I'd imagined. First, there was confusion. His eyebrows drew together as he tried to place me, like he was seeing someone familiar in an unexpected context. Then came recognition, and his eyes widened slightly. But the best part was what came next, the moment when understanding hit him like a physical blow. "Hello, Derek," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. "Surprise." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might actually faint. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. It was like watching a computer trying to process information that didn't compute. "What ... he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" "This," I said, settling back into my chair, "is a business acquisition." "Congratulations, Derek. You just sold Morrison & Associates to me." The silence in the room was deafening. Derek's lawyer was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match, clearly sensing the undercurrent of personal history, but not understanding the full scope of what was happening. Derek found his voice, though it was shaky and higher-pitched than his usual corporate baritone. This can't be legal." "Oh, it's completely legal," I said, gesturing to the stack of documents in front of him. "Everything's been filed properly, all the financials check out, and you've already signed the preliminary agreements. The only thing left is the final transfer of ownership." I leaned forward slightly, making eye contact, which, by the way, you were very eager to expedite. Something about wanting to close quickly before any of your clients decided to leave. Derek's hands were shaking as he reached for the documents, scanning them like he was looking for some loophole, some escape clause that would undo what had already been done. "You can't do this," he said, but there was no conviction behind the words. He was smart enough to know that everything had been done by the book. "Actually, I can." And I did. I stood up again, straightening my suit jacket. "Effective immediately, Morrison & Associates is now a subsidiary of my company. That makes me your new boss, Derek." The word boss hit him like a slap. I watched him physically recoil, his face cycling through a spectrum of emotions: disbelief, anger, humiliation, fear. "You remember what it's like to have a boss, don't you?" I continued, my tone conversational but pointed. "Someone who makes decisions about your career, your responsibilities, your future?" Derek's lawyer finally found his voice. "Mr. Morrison, if you have concerns about the legitimacy of this acquisition, we can—" "No," Derek said quietly, still staring at the documents. "No, it's all legitimate." He looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been respect mixed in with the shock and anger. "How long have you been planning this?" 3 years, I said. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days to be exact. "Ever since the morning you promoted Brad Morrison to a position I'd earned?" Derek winced at the memory. "That was just business." "You're right," I said. "It was just business. And this is just business too." I walked around the table to where Derek was sitting, noting how he seemed to shrink into his chair as I got closer. "The difference is, I'm much better at business than you are." The formal paperwork took another 20 minutes to complete. Derek signed where he was supposed to sign, answered the questions he was supposed to answer, and generally went through the motions of a man who'd just watched his professional world collapse in the most poetic way possible. When it was over, when the last signature had been notarized and the last document filed, Derek sat in his chair staring at nothing. His lawyer was packing up his briefcase with the efficient movements of someone who couldn't wait to get out of the room. "Derek," I said, and he looked up at me with eyes that seemed to have aged 10 years in the past hour. "Don't worry. I'm not going to fire you." For a second, hope flickered across his face. "But you are going to be reporting to Brad Morrison from now on. I'm promoting him to Senior Vice President of Operations." The hope died as quickly as it had appeared. "Brad Morrison? But he's not. He doesn't have the experience." "You're right," I said, gathering my own papers. "He doesn't have much experience. But you know what he does have? Loyalty. And a willingness to learn from his mistakes." I paused at the door, looking back at Derek one more time. "Oh, and Derek? Welcome to the team." Walking out of that conference room felt like floating. 3 years of planning, scheming, and building had led to this moment, and it was everything I'd hoped it would be. Derek Morrison, the man who'd dismissed me as not quite ready for leadership, was now my employee. But as I rode the elevator down to the parking garage, I realized something unexpected. The satisfaction I felt wasn't the burning, vengeful triumph I'd imagined. It was quieter than that, more professional. I'd proven my point. I'd demonstrated that talent and determination could overcome office politics and corporate favoritism. I'd shown Derek, and myself, that being underestimated was just another form of competitive advantage. The revenge was complete, but more importantly, justice had been served. And now I had a company to run. The first Monday morning as owner of Morrison & Associates was absolutely surreal. I walked through the same lobby I'd once rushed through as an anxious employee, past the same reception desk where I'd waited nervously for job interviews, into the same elevator that had carried me to countless meetings where Derek would subtly undermine my ideas. Except now, it was all mine. The staff was buzzing with nervous energy. Word had gotten out over the weekend about the acquisition, though most people still didn't know I was the new owner. The official announcement was scheduled for 10 a.m., which gave me just enough time to settle into Derek's old office, my office now, and prepare for what would undoubtedly be the most satisfying staff meeting of my professional life. Derek was already at his desk when I arrived, hunched over his computer with the defeated posture of a man who'd realized his world had permanently shifted. He looked up when I walked past, and our eyes met for just a moment. I nodded politely, the way you'd acknowledge any employee, and continued toward the corner office that used to be his sanctuary. Sitting behind Derek's oversized mahogany desk felt like sliding into a perfectly tailored suit. Everything fit exactly the way it was supposed to. The morning sunlight streamed through those same floor-to-ceiling windows I'd admired 3 years earlier, except now I was on the other side of the power dynamic. I'd kept my announcement simple and professional. No dramatic reveals, no petty gloating. Just the facts. The company had been acquired by a growing marketing firm. There would be some structural changes, but everyone's job was secure for the immediate future. We were committed to maintaining Morrison & Associates' reputation for quality work and client service. What I didn't mention was how much fun I was going to have restructuring Derek's little empire. The staff meeting was everything I'd hoped it would be. I stood at the front of the same conference room where Derek had announced Brad's promotion, looking out at the same faces that had applauded while my career was being sabotaged. But this time, I was the one making announcements. I know change can be unsettling, I said, watching Derek squirm in his chair like a kid who'd been called to the principal's office. But I want to assure everyone that this acquisition is about growth and opportunity. A few people asked the obvious questions about job security and company culture. I answered them all with the kind of calm professionalism that Derek had never quite managed. Behind his corporate buzzwords and management speak, there had always been an undercurrent of insecurity. He was constantly trying to prove he belonged in that chair. I didn't have that problem. I'd earned this chair the hard way. The best part came when I announced the new organizational structure. Brad Morrison will be taking on expanded responsibilities as Senior Vice President of Operations, I said, watching Derek's face as the words hit him. He'll be overseeing day-to-day operations and will serve as the primary liaison between department heads and executive leadership. Translation, Brad was now Derek's boss. The same Brad who Derek had promoted over me was now the person Derek would report to. The poetic justice was so perfect it almost felt scripted. After the meeting, Derek lingered in the conference room while everyone else filed out. When we were alone, he finally spoke. "This is about revenge, isn't it?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I considered the question for a moment. 3 years ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. The wounded employee in me had wanted nothing more than to watch Derek suffer the way he'd made me suffer. "No," I said finally. "This is about business. You taught me that, remember? It's not personal, it's just business." Derek nodded slowly, like a man accepting his fate. "What happens now?" "Now you do your job," I said. "You report to Brad, you meet your performance targets, and you contribute to this company's success." I paused, letting the reversal of roles sink in. Just like any other employee. The next few weeks were a masterclass in corporate restructuring. I implemented changes Derek had been too scared or too incompetent to make. Streamlined processes, updated technology, performance-based compensation structures. The kind of stuff that actually makes a company more efficient instead of just looking good in PowerPoint presentations. Derek adapted better than I'd expected, honestly. Maybe it was relief at not having to make the big decisions anymore, or maybe he'd finally realized that his managerial style had been holding the company back. Either way, he kept his head down, did his work, and gradually became the kind of employee I'd once been. Competent, reliable, and invisible. The financial results spoke for themselves. Within 6 months, Morrison & Associates was outperforming its previous 3-year average. Client retention was up, employee satisfaction surveys showed marked improvement, and we'd landed 2 major accounts that Derek had been chasing unsuccessfully for years. Brad, meanwhile, was thriving in his new role. Turns out, when you give someone real authority and let them make decisions without constantly undermining their confidence, they tend to rise to the occasion. He'd developed into exactly the kind of leader Derek had pretended to be. The moment that really drove the point home came about 8 months after the acquisition. I was reviewing quarterly reports when Brad knocked on my office door. "Got a minute?" he asked, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk. "Always," I said, setting aside the financial statements. "What's on your mind?" "Derek," he said simply. "I think we need to have a conversation about his long-term fit with the organization." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Don't get me wrong, Brad continued. He's been doing the work, meeting his deadlines, following protocols. But he paused, searching for the right words. He doesn't seem engaged anymore. It's like he's just going through the motions. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Derek Morrison, the man who'd once wielded his authority like a weapon, was now being performance managed by the same employee he'd promoted to spite me. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "I think we should put him on a performance improvement plan," Brad said. "Set some clear expectations. Give him specific goals to hit. See if we can get him re-engaged. If not," he shrugged, "maybe it's time to part ways." I nodded thoughtfully, as if I were considering the recommendation of a trusted lieutenant rather than savoring the most delicious irony of my professional life. "That sounds reasonable," I said. "Put together a plan and we'll discuss it next week." That night, I sat in my home office with a glass of wine and thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years earlier, I'd been a broken, humiliated employee with nothing but rage and a half-formed plan for revenge. Now I was the owner of a successful company, with the man who'd wronged me facing the same kind of career uncertainty he'd once imposed on me. But here's the thing I hadn't expected. The victory felt different than I'd imagined. It wasn't the burning satisfaction of revenge served cold. It was quieter than that, more like the steady confidence that comes from proving yourself right. Derek Morrison had taught me that talent wasn't enough, that hard work didn't guarantee recognition, that corporate politics mattered more than performance. He'd been wrong about the first two, but absolutely right about the third. Politics did matter. I'd just learned to play the game better than he had. The best revenge, it turns out, isn't about making someone suffer. It's about making them irrelevant. Derek had dismissed me as an employee who wasn't ready for leadership. Now he was working for a leader who'd been shaped by his dismissal. I never did fire Derek, by the way. He quit about a year later, citing creative differences with the new direction of the company. His resignation letter was professional and cordial, with no hint of the bitterness I might have expected. Maybe he'd learned something from the experience too. As I write this, Morrison & Associates, now officially rebranded as Summit Marketing Solutions, is one of the fastest-growing agencies in the region. We've tripled our staff, expanded into 4 new markets, and built the kind of reputation Derek always claimed to want, but never quite achieved. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Derek had just promoted me that morning 3 years ago, if he'd recognized my contributions instead of sabotaging them. If he'd been the kind of leader who lifted people up instead of tearing them down. But then I look around my corner office, at the company I built from the ashes of my destroyed career, at the team of talented people who actually respect my authority instead of just fearing it, and I realize something profound. Derek Morrison gave me the greatest gift of my professional life. He forced me to become the person I was meant to be. So thanks, Derek. For teaching me that being underestimated is just another form of competitive advantage. For showing me that sometimes the best way to climb the corporate ladder is to build your own fucking building. And for proving that when someone sabotages your career, the sweetest revenge isn't getting even. It's getting everything.